Welcome to the Superstar Communicator podcast. My name is Susan Heaton-Wright, a leading impact, speaking and communications expert. My aim is to show you how to make an impact so you will be heard, listened to and respected for career success. Listen weekly to the podcast and go to our website, superstarcommunicator.com. Hello everybody, this is Susan Heaton-Wright from Superstar Communicator. Thanks for tuning in today. I thought with it being the beginning of 2021, it would be great to come back to why I podcast, what the Superstar Communicator podcast is about, and plans for the future. I've now been podcasting for 7 years and it has been the most remarkable journey. Some people say that they don't release some podcasts, or in fact they delete them later on so that they're no longer available. That's not the case with me. If you go back to some of the early podcasts, you will hear, I hope, how I have progressed in my podcasting from when I started to now. So why did I set up the podcast? I set it up because I'd heard from an American entrepreneur who did a workshop, a virtual workshop even then, about podcasting. Now, podcasting was already becoming popular in the United States, and the demographic of people that listened was very, very interesting from my perspective. And I procrastinated for a while, partly because I didn't have any journalistic background. I was doing everything from scratch. I certainly didn't have a technical background. But I realised after a while I really was procrastinating and I needed to go ahead because Superstar Communicator, my brand, was all about spoken communication. And podcasts are great for that because you are really listening to the conversation without being distracted by the visual side or seeing what somebody's wearing on a video or the background. So I took a deep breath and I worked out all of the tech. I think that there were two things that I got stuck with, and that was uploading the actual podcast episode onto Libsyn, which is the sort of storage area of podcasts, for want of a better word, and also linking it to iTunes. Looking back, it seems really easy now, but 7 years ago there were not all of these courses that you could go on. There certainly weren't all of these videos that could help you with this, so I was almost on my own with this. Another thing is that, dare I say it, 7 years ago, social media wasn't quite used in the same way as it is now. Certainly Instagram, I don't think that, well, I certainly didn't have an account on Instagram, and there weren't things like Canva that you could easily create gorgeous images. The whole structure and the community was very, very different. Now, when people start a podcast, they usually go on a course, usually quite expensive for what you get, dare I say it, and it's all about the launch. The focus is on the pre-launch, so whetting the appetites of potential listeners, then the actual launch and trying to get that top position, even if it's for a couple of hours, on iTunes. It's almost the equivalent of trying to get the top rated on Amazon even for an hour. But I didn't ever want to do that. Of course, you could focus on trying to be the top when you launched even 7 years ago on iTunes. But my focus was really on creating fantastic content which would help me build up my own brand and also my credibility in what I do. And that's something that I have always held on to, and that I believe is part of the legacy of this particular podcast. So I would put quite a lot of money on a number of podcasts that are being launched, have been launched in the last year, that they will fizzle out, that after a few months people will get fed up of continuing to do all of this work. Perhaps they're not getting the listeners that they feel that they ought to get. It's a long-term project, and goodness me, have I enjoyed it. So what did I want to share in the Superstar Communicator podcast? What content was it? Well, I wanted to share information and ideas and inspiration about the positive impact of spoken communication. Digital communication has really taken over, and even 7 years ago people were hiding behind emails rather than picking up the phone, on posts on Facebook or LinkedIn rather than uploading a video or trying to contact people and have a human conversation. I'm all about having that human connection, and we get that by speaking to each other, hearing other people's voices, not reading what their voice is through text. So since then, I have interviewed many people in all walks of life about how they have used spoken communication in their career development, how they've perhaps used it to make a difference. More recently, I've had a couple of very high profile people who have written books on communication, or it's related to communication. So with the lovely Andy Lapata, he talked about connected leadership, and part of that is spoken communication to develop your business relationships with other people, as well as other authors like Joe McCormack. Looking through the people that I've interviewed, there have been some absolutely fascinating interviews. I was particularly interested in people who were reluctant to speak out. And my aim was that those people who perhaps were a little bit quieter, more reluctant to voice their opinion in meetings or to step up and do a presentation, perhaps they lacked confidence. They were not shining, and they were being undervalued or underestimated. Perhaps they were being ignored, they were spoken over. And I wanted those people to be inspired by the stories, by the masterclasses, by the content, so that they would have the confidence and the skills to step up and voice their opinions, to step up and do that presentation, even if it wasn't the most natural thing for them to do, which is why I come back to the why. Why do you think I created Superstar Communicator? Because I was one of those people. I was one of those people. Even now, I would say that because I'm quite quiet and I'm not constantly blowing my trumpet, there are people who underestimate me. And certainly when I was younger, that was definitely the case, that I would be more considered before I voiced an opinion. And with my upbringing, I was one of those people that was told to be quiet, to wait until people spoke to you, not to argue with people, not to voice your opinion, because nobody will be interested in that. And yet we're all human beings and we do have a right to an opinion. This is not about being loud, but it is about being present in the conversation, whether that is in a meeting, that you are actively present, actively listening, and then contributing when you feel it's right to contribute. But I've also flagged up something else, that you should be listening as well as speaking. And so often there are public speaking podcasts or blogs, and it's all about what I'm going to say, how I'm going to influence people. But any communication is two-way, and there has to be a listener. And if you're an effective listener as well, it makes you an even better communicator. And when you're speaking, if you're listening to the other person when they're making a contribution, you can therefore make an even more credible contribution to the conversation. And you want it to be relevant to the people that you are speaking to, even if your opinion is different to the other people's. So I bring you to the Superstar Communicator methodology. As I went on with my podcast and the other work I was doing, I was encouraged to come up with my own methodology, which of course I called Superstar Communicator. And I identify 5 key areas that I believe are key essential skills to be a great communicator. And the 5 areas are audience, content, preparation, performance, and voice. And in my masterclasses, as well as the interviews, it is quite often that I will be asking questions related to at least one of those areas. Also, I have done masterclasses as well as the interviews with other people, because there are sometimes things that I believe are very useful for me to share with you, the listener. It has been the most amazing journey. I have no journalistic background, so learning how to ask questions and to conduct a proper interview, these are all learning curves, and I know as time has gone on, I have become more confident with that. I have loved meeting people who are my guests and having the opportunity to share this content with you, the listener. So I've also had themes. This last year, I was encouraged by a connection on LinkedIn to conduct a Black History Month. So during October 2020, I had 5 interviews with fantastic guests from the Black community in the United Kingdom. Brilliant content, and I was so pleased to be part of that. Of course, I do International Women's Day every year, but also I have been aware that I need to make things more inclusive. 1 or 2 people contacted me to see how I could be more inclusive with the content that I do and make it more accessible to more people. So as a result of that, I now add the transcripts from each of the podcasts to the podcast notes. Now, obviously, I've done over 200 interviews, so 200 podcasts. So it's quite likely that some of the early ones I'm not able to do just because of time. But now from November onwards, there are transcripts that are in the podcast notes that people who are deaf can download, or if you prefer to read the transcript rather than listen to the podcast, that is there. So what about the future? I have now had nearly 52,000 downloads, which is remarkable. It's fantastic, and I thank you, every single one of you, for being involved in that journey. And I like to hope that some of the content that I'm sharing with you will be of huge value for you. And do let me know if there's a particular podcast interview or podcast episode that has been a game changer for you, because I would love to hear that. I'm still committed to creating high quality content for listeners. I'm not quitting. Since March 2020, I have released 1 podcast a week, and that has been a huge commitment. So from February 2021, I'm going to go back to releasing a podcast once a fortnight. simply because I want to maintain the high quality, but I'm doing so many other things too that I'm stretching myself too much. So I'm just aware of that. However, I am going to be doing on LinkedIn some LinkedIn live interviews, which if you're connected with me on LinkedIn, and please do feel this, send me a connection to Susan Heaton-Wright. Say you're a podcast, that you listen to the podcast. You will then be notified about any LinkedIn live that I'm doing. I've already got a couple of guests lined up, and it's going to be a slightly different format to the podcast, but again, it's very live, and you are able to ask questions live, which is quite exciting. Before I go, I want to ask a couple of things for you. Please subscribe to the podcast on any of the platforms that you currently listen to, but also I would be so grateful if you could leave a testimonial or recommendation. This makes a real difference to me as a podcaster. If you can recommend an excellent guest, let me know. And if there's any topic that you would like me to cover, please get in contact and let me know, because the content is only as good as you, the listeners, and I need feedback for that. So as I go into my 8th year of podcasting, I wish you well and thank you for listening. You have been listening to the Superstar Communicator podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and review the podcast on iTunes and on apps. Please contact us if you want to discuss any topic, could suggest a topic for us to include, or a guest who could come onto the podcast. Go to superstarcommunicator.com.